Welcome to the Tim Booker Book Sharing channel. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our updates. Let's explore the world of books together.
Today I'll be interpreting The Power Law. In the minds of many, venture capital has always been somewhat mythical. Entering at the embryonic stage of a startup, these investors identify valuable seeds among countless wild ideas and pour substantial capital into them. Some among them have reaped astonishingly immense returns. For instance, some early investors in Facebook, now Meta, earned over 1,000-fold return in less than a decade. Similarly, in 1999, Masayoshi Son invested $20 million in Alibaba, which later went public on the NYSE, yielding over $50 billion in returns, a profit of 2,500 times the initial investment. However, such instances are rare. Most startups fail. Therefore, the few successful projects must yield substantial returns to cover the losses of numerous failed ventures. Once successful, the gains for winners explode at an exponential rate. This money-making logic, termed the power law in this book, or sometimes referred to as long-tail investing, indicates that a minute probability of success garners the lion's share of profits. Because venture capitalists operate in a realm governed by the power law, their mindset is unique. While most people make decisions attempting to minimize risk, especially avoiding extreme, low-probability events, venture capitalists focus solely on these low-probability, tail events and work to facilitate their occurrence. To many, making money in venture capital might seem reliant on deep pockets and luck. However, this book seeks to convey that the best venture capitalists consciously create their own luck. They continuously refine their thought processes, improve methodologies, and increase the probability of favorable outcomes, enabling recurring strokes of good fortune. This might remind us of a saying, strong individuals are those who excel in consistently creating their own good fortune. Today, this book's significant aim is to provide a close look at how the most successful venture capitalists or institutions consistently create their own good fortune. Although the Chinese title of this book is The Power Law, its focus isn't solely on the history of venture capital from inception to the present day. You might recall a previous interpretation of venture capital, which detailed the evolution of venture capital over centuries. Compared to that book, this one has a more focused perspective. Temporally, it starts from the 1960s, highlighting the first venture capital in Silicon Valley, Arthur Rock's support in founding Fairchild Semiconductor, and spans across the 60s, 70s, up to various venture capital funds in the 2020s. Geographically, it primarily concentrates on venture capital in Silicon Valley but also provides an overview of venture capital in China and India. The author of this book is Sebastian Mallaby, a renowned British journalist. He has worked for major media outlets like The Economist, The Washington Post, and the Financial Times for many years, specializing in economic and financial reporting. His previously published books, including The Man Who Knew, The Life and Times of Alan Greenspan, and More Money Than God, Hedge Funds and the Making of a New Elite, have received widespread acclaim. The journalistic nature of his profession enables him to vividly narrate intricate and dry histories, infusing them with rich stories and details. Unlike other books that focus on the history of the venture capital industry, this book has a distinctive feature, a clear, problem-oriented approach. The author aims to achieve two goals with this book. Firstly, as mentioned earlier, revealing the investment philosophies of venture capitalists, and secondly, assessing the social impact of venture capitalists, how venture capital changes a region, a country, or even the entire world. In today's interpretation, we'll follow this approach, focusing on the two main questions explored in the book. First, at the micro level, is becoming a successful venture capitalist more dependent on luck or skill? Second, at the macro level, why do certain regions, like Silicon Valley, become centers of innovation and prosperity far surpassing others? How do they accomplish this? Sure, let's delve into the first part and explore the initial question, is becoming a successful venture capitalist more about luck or skill? At the outset, many believe that venture capitalists make money primarily due to luck. This notion isn't entirely baseless. Firstly, the success or failure of entrepreneurial projects inherently involves a degree of randomness. For instance, during the same period, multiple teams might be working on e-commerce platforms, social networks, or search engines. While the talent of founding teams is crucial, facing the unpredictable market, whoever manages to gain traction and secure a foothold also heavily depends on luck. Because of this, many may think that the initial successes of a venture capital firm don't necessarily reflect the skills of the individuals within it. They might have simply appeared in the right place at the right time, essentially relying on luck. These initial successes might earn them a good reputation, attracting more quality projects, consequently potentially enhancing their success rate for subsequent projects. Research from the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research indicates that for every one successful public offering among the first 10 investments of a venture capital firm, the probability of success for subsequent investments increases by 1.6%. So, does this mean that becoming a successful venture capitalist indeed relies significantly on luck? The author disagrees. While acknowledging that a successful public offering slightly increases the probability of future successes, this increment, 1.6%, is minimal. It doesn't prove that a venture capitalist who initially succeeds one or two times will likely continue to succeed consecutively. Moreover, many renowned venture capitalists or institutions, as observed by the author, have experienced reversals. For instance, Arthur Rock, mentioned earlier, made the first venture capital investment in Silicon Valley, setting up Fairchild Semiconductor, more on this later. Afterward, he invested in Intel and Apple, both of which yielded substantial profits. However, beyond Apple, he didn't have many successful projects, demonstrating a reversal. Similarly, a venture capital firm named Mayfield, a leader in the field in the 1980s, faded into obscurity later on. There are numerous similar examples. Well-known venture capital firm Sequoia Capital compiled a list of companies that experienced prosperity but later failed, naming them the deceased. Of course, some venture capital firms or individuals manage to stay in the game for an extended period or rise again after a slump. From the author's perspective, to consistently identify successful projects, the skills of venture capitalists are crucial and are often underestimated by many. The term identifying might be misleading because, after reading this book, it becomes evident that it's far from an effortless task. Before placing bets, during the bets, and even after placing them, venture capitalists engage in substantial proactive work. This is where their skills come into play. Let's begin with what venture capitalists do before placing bets. Their approach differs significantly from other financial investors. While most financial investors analyze numerous financial indicators and historical data before selecting investment projects, venture capitalists encounter embryonic entrepreneurial teams whose projects often haven't started generating profits, sometimes only having a presentation. Therefore, quantitative analysis is challenging, leaving room for qualitative analysis, i.e., subjective judgment. Within these subjective judgments lies perspectives on technological trends, project design, but these vary among individuals and evolve over time. However, after observing and interviewing many famous venture capitalists or institutions in Silicon Valley, the author discovered a common emphasis: investing in the right people. This means they highly value certain personal traits in the founders themselves. Note, these personal traits aren't qualifications or objective conditions like educational background or entrepreneurial experience. In Silicon Valley, there's an abundance of founders from prestigious schools with impressive resumes, making it challenging to filter out the final candidates based solely on these factors. What then catches the attention of venture capitalists? They actively engage with project founders in face-to-face conversations, observing their character traits. For instance, they pay attention to whether the founders possess a strong desire to monetize their knowledge, if they present consistent and coherent ideas or perspectives rather than contradictions, and whether they remain steadfast in their opinions rather than falsely catering to investors. Moreover, when observing founders, venture capitalists have a particular inclination. If a founder appears rebellious, eccentric, or fiercely independent, many venture capitalists don't consider it a flaw but rather a bonus. This is strongly emphasized by the author in the book and reiterated during subsequent interviews. Numerous examples in this regard are provided. For instance, well-known entrepreneur and venture capitalist Peter Thiel mentioned that the people he initially started businesses with had once seriously contemplated making a bomb during high school and even went on to research it. To most, these individuals seemed quite insane, but to Thiel, they were perfect for founding companies. He later co-founded PayPal and a venture capital firm with these individuals. Additionally, Thiel also invested in Elon Musk. After Musk made money from his first entrepreneurial venture, he used half of it to buy a sports car. At that time, he wasn't a tycoon but merely a young man who had just earned his first bucket of gold, uncertain about the future. Later, when driving that car, Musk had an accident, with Thiel sitting in the passenger seat. Musk jokingly told Thiel that he hadn't insured the car. Several similar anecdotes exist, such as Steve Jobs walking barefoot around and washing his feet in the company restroom, or Zuckerberg showing up late to meet venture capitalists wearing pajamas and slippers. In the eyes of many investors, including Peter Thiel, such unconventional behavior in founders signifies a positive sign. Why? A venture capitalist quoted a line from Shaw to explain, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world, the unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." While saying all might sound absolute, venture capitalists indeed find that many exceptional entrepreneurs are often arrogant or seemingly crazy. The author states that this is no coincidence because entrepreneurship often demands unconventional and different ideas. If someone sticks to convention, they may be good at devising a prudent plan, but what they conceive might be something others have thought of too, meaning they might forever remain in crowded, oversaturated markets without making a breakthrough. When the author talks to others about venture capital, he asks them, if venture capitalists discover that a founder has a speeding ticket, is that a plus or a minus? Many students would consider it a minus. However, in the eyes of venture capitalists, it's a plus. Though the behavior itself is negative, what they focus on is the underlying attitude, a willingness to embrace risk. Yes, embracing risk. These words or similar terms repeatedly appear in this book. Venture capitalists hope to see this trait in the talents they invest in and apply it throughout the entire process, before, during, and after investment. Before investment, as mentioned earlier, they are adamant about finding those uniquely talented, rebellious geniuses. Once they discover them, they don't easily let go, they wade through swamps to embrace them. The reason for using the phrase, wading through swamps, is that making an investment is often not easy. It's not like whoever they want to invest in will jubilantly accept the offer. Many company founders are cautious or resistant to capital intervention. Every day, one can witness well-dressed investors chasing after those independent geniuses. Many of these geniuses have technical backgrounds, like scientists, engineers, or coders, and many of them are inherently averse to discussing money or worry that venture capitalists might excessively interfere with their projects once they have a stake. In such cases, venture capitalists must tirelessly persuade them, demonstrate how they can assist the project, show their understanding of the business model, and work hard to gain their acceptance. This process requires patience, empathy, and sophisticated communication skills. Okay, up to this point, we've covered the stage before investment. Venture capitalists look for the right people, and once found, they win over the right people. After investing the money, they can't just sit back, they must nurture the right people. For instance, many entrepreneurs are technically skilled but lack management skills, so venture capitalists help them find suitable managers. Additionally, venture capitalists leverage their network connections to help entrepreneurs market their products, attract more investment, establish information networks through interactions with other entrepreneurs, and more. Furthermore, it's not just about providing resources but also offering emotional support. The author emphasizes that outstanding venture capitalists must become emotional regulators for entrepreneurs. For instance, during times of entrepreneur despondency, they need to generously offer encouragement. When entrepreneurs are complacent, they must question them more and challenge their perspectives. Several studies have shown that venture capitalists' guidance indeed has a positive impact on startups. Companies with venture capital support are more likely to go public than those without. Public companies with venture capital support often perform better than their non-venture-backed counterparts, and they tend to generate significantly more innovations, among other advantages. An interesting study found that if a city where a startup is located initially lacked direct flights, making it difficult for venture capitalists to visit, and later gain direct flights, enabling easier visits from venture capitalists, the performance of these businesses improved. Often, even if a startup project fails, venture capitalists maintain an accommodating attitude as long as they believe the direction is correct. They continue to provide support, helping entrepreneurs navigate through the most challenging stages. This aspect vividly showcases venture capitalists' trait of embracing risk. Of course, while doing all this, venture capitalists themselves must possess a resilient heart to safely navigate through perilous junctures and dark moments, not crumbling before the storms hit. To summarize the first section we just covered, the central question focused on whether becoming a successful venture capitalist relies more on luck or skill. The author believes that venture capitalists don't earn money by casting a wide net and relying on luck. Instead, through a series of processes, finding the right people, winning them over, and nurturing them, they actively increase the probability of good luck through their skills. Next, in the second part, we shift our focus to a broader perspective. Why do some regions, such as Silicon Valley, become centers of innovation and wellsprings of prosperity far surpassing other areas? How do they achieve this? In a book dedicated to venture capital, you might have already guessed that the answer relates to venture capital, and indeed, it does. However, this perspective isn't commonly brought up. Textbooks in human geography, as well as many people's beliefs, often attribute Silicon Valley's status as the world's largest high-tech industrial zone to factors like education, science, and culture, relying on institutions like Stanford University, the abundance of nearby higher education institutions, and the robust technological prowess. These are familiar points. People also highlight the freedom, rebellion, encouragement of innovation, and tolerant attitude towards failure in the Silicon Valley culture. However, the author contends that these factors are not primary. Firstly, if we consider leveraging academic resources and scientific advantages, the urban area around Boston in the U.S. might have a more substantial advantage due to Harvard University and MIT. In terms of research strength in engineering and hard sciences, MIT ranks ahead of Stanford University, and it also houses a larger cluster of research institutions nearby. But despite this, the Boston area hasn't birthed an innovation hub like Silicon Valley. The author argues that this is primarily because Silicon Valley excels at translating scientific research outcomes and technological innovations into profitable companies. Even innovations originating from far beyond Silicon Valley find commercialization opportunities here. And underlying this is the significant role played by venture capital. Regarding cultural factors, the author disagrees with the idea of a cultural determinism, claiming that Silicon Valley possesses an inherently favorable culture for innovation and entrepreneurship. Culture is a vague concept, and directly attributing it as an explanation is too general. Further exploration reveals that this cultural atmosphere is also significantly shaped by venture capital. After observation and research, the author concludes that it's the particular, risk-friendly financing model of venture capital that has shaped Silicon Valley into today's innovation capital. Now, let's delve into the specific process of this shaping. Firstly, it involves providing resources for innovation, as mentioned earlier, funding, manpower, networking, channel resources, business guidance, and more. These resources assist many innovations that would otherwise remain confined to laboratories or server rooms to enter the market. When did this practice begin? It traces back to Arthur Rock's inaugural venture capital investment in Silicon Valley. This investment sparked a trend of transforming scientific research into entrepreneurial ventures. In 1957, Arthur Rock, then working at an investment bank in New York, received a letter from a man named Kleiner in California. Kleiner was the son of one of the bank's clients. He explained that he and 7 other scientists working in a transistor laboratory were considering quitting due to poor management by the lab's eccentric founder. Rather than seeking job referrals, Rock saw an opportunity for them to start a business. Amidst post-war recovery in the United States, Rock believed it was an opportune time to invest in something new. He flew with a partner to California, where Kleiner worked on the West Coast, and met the 8 scientists. Rock straightforwardly suggested, "You should start your own company." Initially incredulous, the scientists were intrigued when Rock explained how each could have ownership in the company and share in its significant profit prospects. Rock observed their positive response, noting that even research-focused individuals had a clear reaction to financial incentives, a good sign. He then clarified his persuasion strategy, motivating their entrepreneurial spirit through returns and promising resources such as funding, managerial talent, and more to ease their concerns. Finally, the scientists agreed to start a business. Rock's colleague produced 10 fresh $1 bills, proposing that each person sign one. These 10 bills became the earliest venture capital agreement in Silicon Valley. Subsequently, Rock fulfilled his promises, securing various resources for the 8 scientists, establishing what later became the renowned Fairchild Semiconductor in Silicon Valley. For the 10 individuals who signed those bills, their risk-taking quickly paid off. In just 2 years, they earned a 600-fold return. Yet, the author believes that the significance of this risk-taking goes beyond financial gain. It pioneered a new approach to combining scientific talent with business operations. Some of the scientists admitted they never thought starting a company was an option until then. This success convinced more scientific talents and investors that this model was feasible. Following this, Silicon Valley witnessed the emergence of more tech innovation companies incubated by venture capital. From the 1960s to the present, the focus of venture capital shifted from electronic computers to the internet, smartphones, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and more, constantly evolving, representing the latest direction of commercializing cutting-edge technology. The book also makes an interesting discovery. The interaction patterns between venture capitalists and entrepreneurial teams have changed over time. Initially, venture capitalists were authoritative, akin to stern fathers, guiding and influencing the direction of growth. However, later on, the entrepreneurial teams gained more say, and venture capitalists became more accommodating, akin to nurturing mothers, respecting the entrepreneur's opinions and providing more autonomy and tailored support. If a turning point were to be identified for this shift, it could be Zuckerberg's meeting with Sequoia Capital. As mentioned earlier, during that meeting, Zuckerberg wore pajamas and slippers. He wasn't merely late, those present noted he had showered and deliberately changed into pajamas. Additionally, despite preparing a presentation, the slide read, 10 reasons why you shouldn't invest in me. Simply put, he genuinely didn't want Sequoia's money. This highlights the shift in status between entrepreneurs and capital, entrepreneurs moving from seeking capital to capital seeking them. Behind this shift are deeper reasons. In the early days, venture capital mainly invested in hardware industries like semiconductors and chips in Silicon Valley, requiring significant funding, which naturally granted investors more authority. In the Internet era, entrepreneurship mainly relied on programming and technological innovation, creating an environment where those who possess technical expertise held more sway. So far, we've discussed how venture capital turns scientific innovation into profitable projects. However, this doesn't fully explain why Silicon Valley specifically became the earliest and most renowned innovation hub globally. This leads us to the second role of venture capital, connecting innovations into a network. Sociologists have found that in competitive areas of Silicon Valley, such as the US East Coast and Japan, the tech industry is dominated by large corporations. But Silicon Valley is different. It has formed an industry cluster composed of startup companies. In an industry cluster, the relationships between companies are relatively loose, weak ties. However, between a large enterprise and its subsidiaries, there are close, strong ties. Sociologists found that regions with a plethora of weak ties foster more innovation than areas dominated by a few strong ties, because of more comprehensive information flow and frequent exchange of ideas. In bars, chance encounters, and casual conversations, ideas spread like wildfire. A key role of venture capitalists is facilitating the creation of more weak ties. A venture capitalist often invests in multiple entrepreneurial teams, introducing them to each other. Moreover, many venture capitalists know each other, further linking their project networks into a more extensive network, exponentially increasing the number of weak ties and birthing more innovations. However, it's also known that among these innovations, only a few succeed, while the vast majority fail. If entrepreneurs fear failure and refrain from trying, it significantly diminishes the innovation potential of a region. This brings us to the third role of venture capital, reducing concerns for innovation. Some venture capitalists promise entrepreneurs before starting a business that even if they fail, they will assist in finding their next job. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, even after a startup project fails, venture capitalists often maintain a tolerant attitude, continuing to support the entrepreneur spiritually, technically, and financially if they believe in the direction or see potential in the technology. The book features several entrepreneurs, including Jobs, who experienced multiple failures before succeeding. The translator, Tian Xian, later in conversation with the book's author, added that in academic research, he found that many venture capitalists or institutions are willing to give entrepreneurial teams a second or even third chance, allowing them to continuously explore and experiment. Such risk-friendly venture capital is more likely to foster successful, innovative projects. Revisiting what was mentioned at the beginning of this part, many say that Silicon Valley fosters a culture of freedom, rebellion, encourages innovation, and tolerates failure. After hearing this, you might share a similar view to the author, believing that this cultural atmosphere, to a significant extent, is also shaped by venture capital. Alright, here we are. We've discussed how venture capital shaped Silicon Valley into the innovation capital. We've seen how venture capital here provides resources for innovation, connects innovations into a network, and reduces concerns for innovation. In the words of the book, venture capitalists shape innovation rather than just passively appear where innovation exists. This logic doesn't just apply to Silicon Valley, it extends throughout the United States. After the 1990s, venture capitalists started venturing globally to seek opportunities beyond the US. Numerous studies have shown that venture capital can drive innovation. The more venture capital funds enter a country, the higher its innovation level. In recent years, in countries or regions with the most vibrant technological innovation, we almost always see the driving force of venture capital. Alright, that's all for today with The Power Law. Congratulations on finishing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom and practice to achieve our financial goals and create a better future together. Thank you, goodbye.